Hello and welcome to the F1 Strategy Report, powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. My name's Michael Lamonato, and this is round 18, the United States Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton had all the momentum heading into Austin, knowing that victory would be just about enough to beat Sebastian Vettel to a 5th World Championship. But instead, Mercedes struggled in the race, and crowd favourite Kimi Raikkonen took his first win in more than 5 years, forcing Hamilton to wait at least one more week to claim the crown. To analyse how Vettel got the chance to fight for one more round, I'm joined by ESPN F1 Associate Editor Nate Saunders. Nate, how you doing?
Hey mate, I'm good. How are you doing?
Yeah, look, really well, considering we've still got a championship fight somehow.
Can we call it a championship fight?
Well, we get to keep calling it that. I think that's the only benefit we really have. Is that we can say the championship's alive.
It's like when one guy's like on the canvas and it's on the 9 count, and the ref's just taking a really long time to call it. We're like, hey, it's still a World Heavyweight Championship fight. The other guy's dead and buried.
Yeah, but the referee in this situation, I guess, being Kimi Raikkonen.
Yeah, I guess so. He's the guy who runs in, like in the WWE, runs in and like influences the end of the match, I guess.
Yeah. He took an unexpected win in the United States.
Awesome win.
Always popular when Kimi Raikkonen wins. Gave the crowd something to cheer about, even if he didn't give himself something to cheer about. Yeah. Typically Kimi Raikkonen. I think the line was, "It won't change my life."
Oh, well, he said that about 4 times as well. He was like, it's just a number. It was great. I was so Kimi about it.
But it was interesting in the sense that it's so popular that Raikkonen won, and so unexpected as well. His first win in more than 5 years. That it did overshadow for at least a time the fact that everyone expected the championship to finish this weekend. Yeah. And it's still going by virtue of the fact Hamilton couldn't overcome Raikkonen and Vettel didn't do quite badly enough to throw it away himself.
It was like vintage Vettel this year, like just not enough of either thing. Mm-hmm. But I actually liked that it didn't end, because I think if we'd be sitting here talking about Lewis now, if the championship had been wrapped up, and we kind of look. Kimi still would have won, but it would have been overshadowed hugely by the fact that Lewis had done it. And it was such a cool story, and everyone, like you said, wanting to do it, that I'm glad that didn't happen. And we had Max in there as well, which was another cool story.
Yes.
And I know we'll talk about that later as well, but that I thought was actually probably the standout performance of the race, for me anyway.
Absolutely. 18th to 2nd, certainly a big performance. Let's start right at the beginning of this weekend. Yep. Friday practice was completely rained, well, nearly completely rained out. There was some running, but only wet weather running on intermediate tyres. And it's not the first time that's happened here, and not the first time it's certainly happened in the past. And that has a big effect on race weekends and how they're set up. Yeah,
massively. I mean, the interesting thing was the next day talking to people after qualifying, and all of them were saying, like, when you lose a day, especially when you lose FP2, which is obviously the representative one for the rest of the weekend, it means that if you get FP3, as they did, you're cramming 3 hours worth of Friday and the hour of FP3 into 1 hour of FP3. And as soon as we knew it wasn't going to rain on Saturday, all that running was pretty much not invalidated, but it's not that representative. And crucially, they didn't understand any of those tyres, and especially when it came to blistering and the softs and the super softs, etc. And I actually think it kind of, for me, I've always thought there should be less practice. I mean, or we should go straight into a competitive session. And the fact that the race played out the way it did makes me think if we didn't have as much practice and the teams were a bit more blind about things, maybe we'd have a fun race. I don't know what you think about that, but maybe
I mean, that certainly is what's borne out, and it's maybe exciting to think that I think the early forecast suggests Friday in Mexico should also be wet, which adds an extra element of spice, because it does. I mean, Formula One teams are so good at, being Formula One teams, setting up their cars, knowing what they've got to do. They do it 21 times a year. To remove 90 minutes of practice does have an effect.
Yeah, huge.
It's worthwhile noting that the teams still are roughly in the competitive order we expect, but it does add a degree of variability like we saw in the race, where no one really understands how the race can get from A to B.
Yeah, one of the interesting sessions was Kevin Magnussen on Saturday, and he said that losing Friday meant that you kind of just hit the ground running on Saturday, and if you make even the slightest misstep Friday, which he said that he just did on setup, you go into qualifying and you're already on the back foot, and then, even worse, and then you go into the race, in his case, with a lower grid position than he thought he should have had, and it changes the whole weekend. So even if it's, like he was saying, especially in the midfield, 2/10 there is the difference between 7th and 12th. So it might not have as big an impact at the front, but in the midfield it definitely does. Yeah,
absolutely. Another thing worth considering in the run into this race was the fact, obviously, as we've been talking about, the championship was on its last legs, continues to be. But that was largely because over the course of the last month, Ferraris really lost the performance initiative. They'd had probably the fastest car for a lot of the season, if not all of it. and even if not by a much. But over the last couple of rounds, Mercedes is really, now whether or not they've taken a step forward or Ferrari's taken a step back, either way, they've moved forward. Everyone expected that to be the case again here. It wasn't really how it turned out. Do you put that down to the rain, or is it more about these updates they've taken off the car?
Yeah, I think it's this. Vettel was very kind of. It was interesting what he was saying. Like, we've had to go a few steps back, and he basically said, when you've done that, it shows you've made an error somewhere.
Yeah.
So it looks like they've basically kind of had to circle back to where they were a few rounds ago. And if you actually look at how the season kind of played out, it did seem like Ferrari suddenly just lost their performance.
Yeah.
People were speculating, was it down to the sensor the FIA had on the car, etc., etc. But a much more logical explanation would be that they've just taken such a wrong step, and then they've replicated it with the next few steps. So I think maybe the rain played into it a bit, but it seemed on absolute race pace that Ferrari was the stronger team than Mercedes. And if you look at the last two races, you wouldn't have predicted that at all.
No.
So I think it's the upgrades they've taken off the car, which then you wonder how a team that's leading a championship can go so badly wrong. I don't know.
Well, the incredible thing about what Sebastian was saying about these upgrades is he made the time reference 3 or 4 months worth of upgrades.
Yeah.
Which is incredible on two parts. A, that it's taken 3 or 4 months to decide actually this is the wrong development part. But second to that, they took off 3 or 4 months worth of performance upgrades and were still faster than Mercedes on race pace.
Yeah. I mean, either Mercedes is stood still or Mercedes is. I think Mercedes has made very, very incremental but very slow gains, and they've worked on different parts of the car, whereas Ferrari made such a big jump at the start of the year. But 3 months, you're going back to sort of the end of the triple header sort of time, which is, and you've got a summer break in there as well. So, I know there's a shutdown, but I've never heard of a team admitting that before. Or at least a team fighting for a championship, that, hey, the last 3 months of work we've done has basically just been completely useless and has actually cost us a championship probably. So, really bizarre. And I wonder, after what happened last year at Ferrari with reliability costing them the championship, if they've lost this championship because of Vettel's errors, but also because they've taken this huge wrong step. I mean, what do you do with the organisation then? You're like, guys, we've got to stop shooting ourselves in the foot like this.
It is the wrap-up for Ferrari at the end of the season would be fascinating, to be a fly on the wall in Maranello.
I mean, it's not going to be a comfortable party to be at if you're anyone who's not Kimi Räikkönen who's just leaving at the end of the year. You can just be like, all right, see you later, guys.
He will surely win the last 3 races as well, Kimi Räikkönen.
Yeah, we have a theory that Kimi's just going to sweep up and then go into next year as 4 consecutive race wins.
Hey, look, you heard it here first. Indeed, it does happen. Yeah. Going into qualifying, if we talk about Sebastian Vettel almost willingly letting this championship go, had a penalty as well to serve for disobeying red flags. I know there was some contention amongst drivers as to how that should be enforced, but the fact was that it had been enforced multiple times this season already.
Yeah, and I think it's important to actually say that the penalty itself was pretty unlucky, because we've seen Ocon got caught out in Japan, Ricciardo got caught out in Australia, and it's pretty much a black and white rule. If you're faster than this delta here, it's a penalty. And what he was saying was he would have had to slam on the brakes, stop, because it wasn't for, there weren't people on track, it was gravel on track. So I think that was unlucky, but it was 3 places, and he still had a chance to get himself back in there. And in qualifying, Kimi showed the pace of the car, so it was another case where we would sat on Saturday evening, weren't we, saying like, I mean, this should be Ferrari, should be out in the front. Yeah. And it just, if I think I've used the phrase, this like perfectly encapsulated the season like 3 times in the last 4 races, because every time Seb does something, it just seems to encapsulate what we've seen happen. Yeah, for every positive action. But I felt I felt he was unlucky with the penalty, but he then didn't help himself from that point on. Yeah, absolutely. Also, 2 other things to note from qualifying. One, which we will talk about later on, was that Max Verstappen suffered suspension failure in Q2, which left him initially 14th, and then the subsequent gearbox penalty dropped him to 18th. But then most interestingly was that Kimi Räikkönen was the only of the then top 5 drivers, excluding Verstappen, to qualify in Q2 on the ultra soft tyre as opposed to the more durable, more flexible super soft. It's not the first time, obviously, that drivers have used the super soft or the medium compound tyre. It's going to be much easier to talk about this next season. In Q2. That's compound A and compound C you're talking about, right? But this was almost, I mean, it made more sense to use that middle tyre considering there was a lack of tyre information. That's the flexible tyre. But in retrospect, we can really look at Ferrari already taking this aggressive posture into the race, saying Raikkonen's going to be our highest placed driver.
give him that start line advantage, which ultimately, if we now look into the race, exactly paid off.
Yeah, and it shows the luxury you have when you're not in Mercedes' position, where you're like, look, there's no need to take any risks at all. And if you do that and it backfires, it's a disaster. But yeah, I think given what we saw at the start and how important Raikkonen beating Lewis into Turn 1 was, I think it was a pretty good decision in the end, because if he hadn't got past there, it's the sort of circuit where it's actually quite... There's places to overtake, but it's actually more difficult to overtake than people maybe give it credit for. We saw a few overtakes during the race, but unless you're willing to like lunge down the inside of 14 or Turn 1, during the circuit itself, there's not so many. So yeah, that was ballsy of them. I wonder if they'd have done it with Vettel as well.
Yeah.
I assume they would have done, if he didn't have the penalty, because with the penalty it changed everything. But yeah, I assume they would have done. Yeah,
and it really set up the race from there, because, like you say, overtaking at most circuits, to be honest, is difficult when the cars are extremely closely aligned in pace, which the Ferrari and Mercedes this weekend were, which makes it that much more difficult. But this was really the first decisive moment of the race, was Raikkonen getting past Hamilton at Turn 1, because it set in motion a series of decisions for Lewis Hamilton's race that ultimately conspired not only to lose him the race, but to drop him even to third place behind Max Verstappen. And the first actually came, ironically enough, from Daniel Ricciardo, who, for not for the first time, retired from a race with a power unit-related problem.
Yeah, luckily he doesn't have to deal with Renault. Oh, wait. Wait a sec.
Lap 10, or lap 9, I think the failure happened, and the virtual safety car was triggered by lap 10.
Yeah.
And we had this, obviously, with a safety car at any point in time, a potential pit stop window open. Lewis Hamilton was the only driver to make use of that. He was told to do what Raikkonen didn't do. Yeah. Raikkonen briefly looked like he fainted towards the pits, didn't go in. So Hamilton stopped very early for a runner starting on the super soft tyre. They weren't meant to stop till around lap 20 approximately. But it seemed like the aggressive and correct decision at the time, didn't it?
It did, and you can look at it, and obviously when you unpack stuff, it's easy to say they did this wrong or whatever. And in an ideal world, obviously, if that had been a couple of laps later, it would have been a masterstroke, because it was only really, you're talking about a couple of laps margin of error here. But if they'd just done the same as Kimi, Lewis still gets stuck in the dirty air of Kimi later in the race. That's what led to a lot of the blistering. That's what led to all the issues that he was having during both of his stints. So I think they went to win the race. They tried to do something aggressive, and it was either do that or copy Kimi's strategy. And I don't think, given the lack of straight line speed they had, I don't think they would have compensated enough in the corners to get past Kimi on track, because that's what he would have had to have done. So I agreed with it. It was obviously, like you said, the issue was what happened after it, the sequence that followed, and the fact that when they made that decision, I don't think they imagined that later in the race Max would be up there in second position. I think that kind of, in hindsight, they might have made a different call if they'd known they had another car to clear before getting past Kimi as well.
Worth emphasising as well, obviously in a situation like this, there's a lot of talk after the race about whether or not the championship battle weighed in on the strategic decision. Emphasising, like you said there, that this was an aggressive strategy call that was aimed at winning the race. A, because they didn't expect Verstappen to be there. But more to the point, at that point, Sebastian Vettel had fallen down the order. He was unlikely to be competing for the podium. And therefore, second place would have been enough to guarantee the championship, but they were looking higher than that. This was purely that attitude that maybe they learned in the Nico Rosberg days of really taking it one race at a time and taking that race in isolation.
Yeah, I think so. And also, I think in some races, just going for the best result is the best approach. It sounds really stupid, but you can get into a weird kind of rhythm if you start being like, well, let's finish second, let's finish third, let's finish fourth, or whatever. You start making decisions that don't actually make any logical sense in the context of that race, and you end up doing things because you're trying to get a certain position or trying to do something different. So I think they treated it as if it was a normal race, just a race like race one in the season or something. I think they would have done the same call, or whoever was second in that instance would have done the opposite of the leader. So I liked it. I didn't have any problem with it. I know people were saying Mercedes messed up, but I think it was something they had to do. I don't think Lewis would have been happy I don't think he had the pace on a one-stop strategy to win.
There are a couple of things that happened in that second stint as well that defined the timing of the second stop and ultimately the success of that third stint. The first of them was, and you touched on it a moment ago, that he pushed quite hard to recover the only 9 seconds he'd lost ground to against Kimi Raikkonen, because the idea was he'd be right up behind Raikkonen again and essentially be on the same strategy as him anyway, but with fresher tyres.
Yeah.
And not for the first time this season. In fact, the direct opposite thing happened in Italy, where Raikkonen was behind Hamilton. Blistered, or as a result set in motion the actions that would lead the tyres to blister, essentially by overheating them quite early. So maybe already there's a sort of a crack that's appearing in that strategy, right? It didn't have to go exactly the way it did.
Yeah, and there was also some traffic along the way that he hit, because Lewis came out of the pits and they said, you're 9 seconds behind Kimi, and he said, how on earth am I 9 seconds back from the second stop? But that was because of what had happened to him in that middle stint of being stuck in that traffic when he really needed to just be building that gap for track position afterwards. So I think it's a good way of putting it. Cracks in the strategy start to appear when you start to kind of unpick it from that point.
Yeah, and of course then the timing, Toto Wolff says this committed them to a two-stop, and realistically it did, because it was way beyond the range of the soft tyre, although it would hardly have been the first time this season that a set of tyres went way longer than they were supposed to, and we will talk about Max Verstappen in a moment. But the timing of that second pit stop should have been the key thing for Mercedes to be considering, and indeed presumably they were. The blistering was getting worse as he progressed in this stint, but crucially, he was holding a approximately 17-second advantage over Raikkonen, which was thought to be about key, because the pit stops are worth around about 20 seconds here, given maybe a 4-second deficit or so after the pit stop, and then that point he'd have fresher tyres to be able to attack. But something happened right towards the end of his stint, which was he encountered traffic, as you said, around about lap 35.
Yeah, and he had the gap before it, or at least he was very much on, way closer than he would have been. And then after... I'm not sure you've probably got the exact laps written down, but I think those are actually the laps that probably cost him, because he then spent a chunk of his final stint basically undoing that damage and, laps that he should have been there attacking Max and Kimi, or just Kimi if he'd come out at a certain point.
He lost 7 seconds in about 6 laps in traffic, which was huge.
Right before his pit stop.
Right before his pit stop. Which really, and this is the strategic question of this part of the race, was should he been brought in earlier? And I know the idea was obviously to give him that fresh tyre advantage later in the race as much as possible, so to have a shorter second stint, if you like. But then in pitting him late as well, they also lost ground to Verstappen. So if there's one moment, if you did want to blame Mercedes for anything, people who want to attack Mercedes, is it this 5-lap period where they really did throw this race away?
Yeah, I think this is probably it, because we could see it. I remember because we were sat on the same row, weren't we? And we were kind of like, well, okay, Lewis has lost a bit of time on that lap. It's probably time to start coming in. Loses time again, and you can see the gap to Kimi coming down, and that's, like you said, the key one. I wonder whether they were wary of the traffic becoming a factor later on in the race. So obviously if you clear the traffic, come back out or whatever. I don't know whether that played in what their data was saying, but to me that was when I was looking back at it last night and this morning. That was when I thought he lost the race. There was because that time he kind of used up a lot of the performance of his tyres, kind of getting back to Max, and then rather than come out right behind Max and have completely fresh set to attack him. And probably would have got past him pretty easily, and then attack Kimi. So I think it was key, because it's lap 37. So, if he'd come in lap 32, lap 31, I think this would be a different story. Because as soon as he's past Kimi as well, he doesn't need. He can just manage the tyres from that point, even if towards the end of the race they're problematic. Because Kimi wouldn't have had the tyres to fight him.
And so, looking at that third stint, lost in those 7 seconds was the place to Max. Had he stopped earlier, he well could have at least come out side by side with him, if not ahead of him. But second was the fact that traffic that had slowed down the end of that second stint had to be passed again, right at the very beginning, as you mentioned, the third stint, taking away, and Hamilton acknowledged this after the race, that the best part of the new tyres is really those first 2 or 3 laps. And if they're wasted in traffic, suddenly that new tyre advantage they were aiming for by delaying that stop, well, it was less. It didn't really add up to what they expected it to be by the end of the stint. Which means at the end of the day that he couldn't pass Max Verstappen. He couldn't pass Kimi Raikkonen, even had he had passed Max Verstappen. And that's where the race seemed to be lost.
And I think that's exactly it. You always want to make sure that your guy gets out of a pit stop in a position where where the advantage you've given him with those fresh tyres can be used. And like you said, even if he'd come out just behind Max or whatever, I don't think it would have been an issue too bad. He could have made the ground he needed to. So this just shot. I think as soon as that happened, it was very unlikely he was going to win the race. I think he still could have finished second. But Max, and Max is a bit of an obstacle anyway, as we've come to know. So yeah, getting past him would have been difficult as well.
Let's consider Max's position now, because as you said, the obstacle is a good word. That was really, for most of the race, up until the last 2 laps of the race, the thing that was preventing him from claiming the championship until Vettel recovered and passed Bottas. An ambitious and unusual race strategy for him. Started on the soft tyre, down in 18th. Yeah. Made up 9 positions on the first lap, so that was half the work done essentially. Good on him, well done. But then come lap 22, roughly when everyone starting on the ultra soft or super soft tyres was stopping, he did as well. He sort of kept track with them and switched over to the super soft tyre for a really ambitiously long 34 lap stint. And who'd have thought he'd be able to make that last?
I don't think many people. I mean, Magnussen did 30 laps on the super soft, and that was out of necessity of where it was again trying to get up. But the only other longer one than that was Brendan Hartley, 27 laps on the super soft. And I think the assumption that most teams had was that Max wasn't going to be a factor in it, because he'd have to go longer on that set of tyres at the start, or he would go longer on that set of tyres because the super softs couldn't last for that long, and he wouldn't have elevated himself up there. I think the key was clearing all those cars at the start, because if it spent a few more laps, like kind of slaloming through the guys that he had the pace advantage over, it might have hindered his progress a bit. And then Vettel being knocked back as well kind of helped, because it took one of the quick cars out of contention. But yeah, it was. I think Verstappen's been really impressive recently. I think it was proof that he's like maturing a lot, kind of mentally, which we weren't saying about him at the start of the season. Yeah,
not in the first 6 rounds of the season. It's a completely different Max Verstappen. I want to contrast his strategy as well briefly with Valtteri Bottas. We talk about drivers who, Max Verstappen was in victory contention, but Valtteri Bottas never was, as long as Lewis Hamilton was going to be out on track. Bottas tried the one-stop, a conventional one-stop, super soft to lap 23 and then soft for the rest of the race. Couldn't make that manage in the same way that Hamilton couldn't make a 2-stop race manage. I mean, this really just does underscore the fact that Mercedes was really quite out of sorts in this Grand Prix.
Yeah, I think so. And I think actually the fact that you had, my colleague at ESPN, Lawrence Edmondson, in his analysis wrote a really pretty good line on it, that it was basically Lewis came out of the race wanting Mercedes to have done a one-stop, unhappy with his 2-stop. Bottas came out of that race unhappy with his 1-stop, wishing they'd done a 2-stop. And the fact that they couldn't really get either of them done underlines the fact that we've been talking about. The race pace wasn't there for them. And I think as well, Bottas is he's in that horrible situation where the focus is just that Lewis is the one that want to win races. And I just wonder, I know they always say we treat both guys equally, but when you have so much focus on one car, we've seen it with Kimi all year with Ferrari. It just seems like they just forget the other guys in the race. And at the end, I think it reminded me of Silverstone when Bottas was fighting Vettel for a bit in the lead. Yeah. And then his tyres, they didn't just kind of drop off. They just disappeared. And I think he dropped down the order in that race as well. In this one, he didn't drop down the order, but he just, once Vettel got past him, he had nothing left.
Yeah, it was the last 3 laps where his tyres were completely gone. And that's when Vettel got past and ultimately secured one more race in this championship fight, when it became obvious Hamilton wasn't going to pass anybody from 3rd place. So and 3 laps was all that really counted there. Yeah,
and I think the blistering that Mercedes was encountering came down to, there was a few factors there, but the way they set their car up as well. They had to negate the fact they had none of this straight line speed compared to Ferrari, or at least they didn't have the advantage there. So they set the car up, and in the corners, they're just churning through those tires, especially the soft tyre. And as soon as they realised that was happening with Lewis's car, it was too late really to do anything about Bottas' strategy, because otherwise you just basically give the position to Vettel anyway. So I think it was again a case of, if they had the Friday data,
absolutely,
I think Bottas would have been in a much better position, but obviously he wasn't. So.
Yeah, and if just touching on that idea that Bottas sort of ended up being Mercedes' forgotten man, was even undercut by Max Verstappen. Again, perhaps because no one expected Verstappen to legitimately play a role in this race, but they weren't even alive to the idea that perhaps that might be a possibility only 22 laps into the Grand Prix.
Yeah, and I think that, I remember when Max emerged, the dust kind of settled, and I was like, wait, Verstappen, it says he's pitted, but he has, he kind of done that type of thing. But it makes me wonder, and I wanted to ask you this, what do you think? Obviously, Ricciardo was running strongly when he retired. Is that a car that could have won the race if he'd been in there, or is it a second and third for Red Bull instead of a?
Well, it is an interesting question, isn't it? Because it seems like Ferrari had the quickest car this weekend, notwithstanding that Verstappen was close, but then Verstappen didn't really have that amount of performance left in the tyres at the end of the race to genuinely challenge Kimi Räikkönen. He sort of had a little bit of a look here, but it wasn't in the way that Hamilton was challenging him. But had you had Ricciardo on a conventional top 5 strategy and ahead of Verstappen for the sake of argument, as he was when he retired, then possibly he would have been in a position maybe to pressure Raikkonen. But then you've got to consider, well, it's straight line speed between Red Bull Racing and Ferrari, right? And Ferrari has become the king team of that statistic on a race. It would have been very interesting, though. It really would have been interesting. If we want to maximise our hypotheticals, had Vettel not crashed on the first lap? Well, then what are we considering?
Well, this is it. And I think, Vettel, Toto Wolff said it afterwards, like, that he could have won that race. And you wonder, I assume he would have done, well, he would have had to have done something maybe similar to Max, but really, I think he definitely would have been ahead of Hamilton. There's no doubt about that. If you see how Hamilton struggled, and as soon as he got close to Kimi, he would have. Ferrari would have switched them over. We're past the day of anyone pretending that Ferrari doesn't use team orders, like they were claiming over the year. So I think he could have won it, and that's the shame. That's the shame of it, because if he had done, it would have been like, okay, well, now we're kind of back towards that margin of like uncertainty for Mercedes, where if Lewis messes up or has an issue, he's back in it. But I think he had the pace to do it. And the curious thing is, if him and Ricciardo had been in the fight, at the end we could have had 4 cars going for the win, and Lewis Hamilton trying to get fourth off Verstappen in that, or Ricciardo or whoever was there. So it would have been, in terms of championship context as well, quite fun. It
would have been something really, really interesting. It was a really, I suppose, an extremely high-velocity chess match at the front. It ended up in Kimi Räikkönen's favour. The first of 4 successive wins. I think we're all in agreement.
Well, first of 4 this season, and then he's got obviously going to roll that tide, ride that wave into next year.
It was a great race. It really delivered. It delivered an exciting result for the fans, and kept the championship alive one more race.
It's 9.5 is the count now. On the boxing ring.
Nate, it's been a pleasure to talk to you about it.
Thanks, dude.
That was Nate Saunders, Associate Editor for ESPN F1. The Strategy Report is a Beer Mogul podcast powered by Apex Race Manager, the mobile race management simulator. You can get every episode by subscribing on Google Podcasts and Apple Podcasts, or on your favourite podcasting app. And you can leave a review to help other F1 fans find the show. You can also read the written report at f1strategyreport.com and stay up to date by finding us on Facebook and Twitter. My name's Michael Lamonato. You can find me at Michael Lamonato on Twitter, and I'll catch you in just a week's time for a wrap-up of the Mexican Grand Prix.